these tiny totes are easier to sew than you think. They're fun, they're fabulous, and beginner friendly. I started by straightening the fabric so I can work on grain. For a little bag like this, you can use the grain or the cross grain. Working on grain is most important for garments because it will affect how something hangs off your body. But even with a little bag like this, it can sort of distort the shape a little bit. However, when it's in use, nobody's going to notice. So don't stress about it too much, but it's just good to know. To sew this mini tote, I'm using a peachy quilting cotton. It's easy to work with, which is great if you're a beginner because it presses well and it comes in many colors and lovely prints. Now keep in mind that because we're going to fold the fabric in half and there's going to be a fabric fold at the bottom of the bag, that if you pick a fabric with an obvious directional print, like with text, it will be upside down on one side of the bag. For the handles, I cut 2 handles at once and then fold the piece of fabric in half to separate them. To sew the French seam, we're going to fold the bag in half and align it at the top. But you gotta make sure you have the outside of the fabric or the right side of the fabric on the outside so it's visible to you. Now for the handles, we're going to do the opposite, so the right side of the fabric should be on the inside of the strap. I tend to use little to no pins, but feel free to use as many pins as you need. I'm starting with the side seams of the bag, so I'm going to do the first pass for the French seam, and I'm going to sew at 1 centimeter from the raw edge. Now remember, the right side of the fabric has to be on the outside, and the wrong side of the fabric should be on the inside. Now I'm moving on to the straps, and again I'm sewing at 1 centimeter from the raw edge. And the second strap, I'm going to butt it up against the first one so I don't have to deal with the long thread tails. Another plus is that the feed dogs have more fabric to grab onto, so your project is more easily transported through your sewing machine. Straps are now ready to turn and press, but the bag needs a little bit more work. We're going to trim the seam allowances by about half and then turn the bag so that the right side of the fabric is on the inside and the wrong side of the fabric is on the outside. To get a nice fold on the stitch line, I'm going to press my seams open. If you don't have one of these sleeve ironing boards, you can always roll up a towel to go inside. Don't worry if you can't reach all the way to the tip. We are going to give the bag one more press before we sew the seam allowances, so if it needs fixing, we can do it then. There's always a lot of pressing and prepping with French seams, but I think it's worth it. Because if you leave the seam allowance too wide or you don't fold it neatly on the stitch line, there's a chance of threads or fabric poking out on the outside of the bag once it's finished. I don't mind, I just try to take my time and enjoy the process. To get a neat fold on the seam line, it helps to roll the fabric between the tips of your finger before you press it. After pressing, you can see that the raw edges are now nicely tucked inside the folded fabric, and after we sew another line of stitches, they will be enclosed in the seam line. If you find it hard to press the straps after turning, you can also try to press the seam allowances towards the strap before you turn. I do think that I prefer the method of pressing after turning, but I wanted to show both methods because then you can decide for yourself. When I bought this loop turner from Prim, I never thought I would be using it as much as I do, but here we are, many years later, I still use it. I actually love this tool, but you don't need it. Of course, you can also use a safety pin and some string. So after turning again, I'm pressing the seam allowance and the strap. This is the one where I pre-press the seam allowance, and what I'm finding is that the seam allowance sort of rolls up on itself on the inside. Maybe it's my technique, but this is why I prefer the other method over this one. After pressing the seams, you want to make sure they are the same length before you attach them to the bag. Now, if you want to do some top stitching on the straps, this is the moment to do it. I'm just going to leave them as they are. I am going to mark the seam allowance on both sides of the straps. That way it's easier for me to attach them later on. And I'll know for sure that I didn't twist them, because I've definitely done that in the past. Alright, back to the sewing machine. So if you want to top stitch the straps, now's the time to do so. I'm going to skip that step and just do the final line of stitches to complete the French seam. For the final line of stitches, I'm going to sew 1 centimeter from the folded edge. And then repeat the step on the other side. And once you're done with the second line of stitches, the raw edges are fully enclosed in the French seam. This is an optional step, but I'm going to snip through the seam allowance at 1 centimeter from the top edge. What this will do is, this way I can nest the seams and I can reduce a little bit of bulk and make it easier to sew over the side seam. And before I finish the top edge of the bag, I'm going to press the seam allowances to one side. In the video I'm mirroring the sides, but in reality it doesn't really matter as long as you press the little snip piece to the opposite side of the longer seam allowance, and then it's all good. Now to finish the raw edges of the top of the bag, I'm first going to fold the raw edges 1 centimeter into the wrong side or the inside of the bag. I prefer to do the sides first because I have the little snip at 1 centimeter to guide me, plus the sides are a little bulky, so if I press those first and then move to the center of the bag, I can just pull on the seam allowance and the center of the seam sort of naturally falls in place at 1 centimeter. I'm going to do the same on the other side, pulling on the side seam and then putting my thumbs on the seam allowance to secure it. Next I'm going to fold the top edge in again, but this time 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. Now if you find 2.5 centimeters a little bit too wide, you can always opt for a narrower hem, like 2 centimeters, but I'm matching the straps, so if you want to customize this size, I would suggest also making a slightly narrower strap. And again, I'm starting at the side seams and then pulling on the side seams to do the center of the bag. Before I place the straps, I'm doing a quick tidy of some stray threads. You can either cut them off or tuck them under. Before I mark the placement for the straps, I'm going to make sure that the bag is folded on the seam allowance, and I'm measuring from the seam allowance in by 4 centimeters. For the next step, we're going to sew as close to the folded edge as possible. I like to have my needle position slightly off center while I aim the folded edge to the gap in the presser foot, and this helps me to get a nice and even stitch line. And while I'm sewing, I don't really pay attention to what the needle is doing. I'm just focusing on aiming the edge of the fabric to the gap of the presser foot. So here I decided I wasn't quite happy with the placement, but honestly it was nitpicking. It would have been fine and I could have just kept sewing. I'm almost back at my starting point and now I'm going to sew over the starting stitches so I can secure them. But first I'm moving the thread tails out of the way so they're not tangling with the stitches and leaving an ugly bird's nest. The last step will be to flip up the handles and attach them to the top of the bag. Before I pin them in place, I use my nails to sort of finger press them up and work my way around the bag. I pinned all the straps to secure them before sewing. However, I realized when sewing I didn't really like the placement. I should have placed them closer to where the presser foot hit the strap, because in the way that I did it, there was just more chance of the strap shifting. So somewhere along the sewing I realized and I changed one of the pins, but I think it's probably the last one. Before I start sewing, I do a final check to see if all the straps line up and if they're at a nice 90-degree angle to the top of the bag. Start sewing at the side seam and I don't backstitch. I'll secure the stitches and backstitch when I get back to the beginning. Once I get close to my starting point, I make sure to pull aside the thread tails from the starting stitches so that they don't tangle while I backstitch.